So I learned a little bit about Fort William Henry from someone who is a reenactor. Uh, During the French and Indian War, on a special date, the French came from what is now called Fort Ticonderoga down Lake George here. And Lake George came all the way up here, the gentleman said, on St. Patrick's Day. And the lake was frozen. They came all the way up here on ice skates. 1,200 French soldiers laid siege for a few days here on the fort against 250 British and Irish soldiers. Now, the only reason why the French attacked on that day is that they were hoping that the men stationed here would be drunk, which is quite ironic because, as I was told and as I learned, that the man in charge here, he was British, and he didn't fall for the typical, everybody's Irish on St. Paddy's Day, so he didn't let anybody drink. And these 250 men that were here, as I learned, I gotta take a moment. That is beautiful. You can see that behind me. It's all beautiful. So anyway, he didn't allow them to drink at all, so they were sober. Quite a few soldiers that were sober enough to be able to be on alert and fight those French that came down Lake George from the north. Because right now I'm facing north, and and 250 soldiers. It was more, but disease ran rampant during that winter, and there were bodies, as I was told, that was stacked up on the side of the fort, sadly, waiting to be buried. But up here in New York, it gets so cold that the ground freezes. And that's still typical today, because I know people who passed on and they've had to wait months after passing to be buried because of how frozen the ground is. So, as you see, it's a spectacular view, but it wouldn't have been a spectacular view having 1,200 Frenchmen coming down there. So, yeah, I am here just on a whim, mainly just to learn about the fort. And plus, this is my first French and Indian War site I've ever visited. Even though I've been to Lake George before, never got to visit this spot. There's another one where I learned a story. The French and Indians who attacked this fort near the end of the war, they attacked it, and the commanding officer who was in charge of the fort was believed to have reinforcements come from a fort 16 miles, Fort Edward. He put up a flag of truce, or a flag of surrender, came out, met the French general that was in charge, and the French general said, "What are your conditions to surrender?" And the general said, that was in charge of the fort, said, "Oh no, I'm pretty much just waiting on reinforcements to come." And the French general kind of shook his head, he said, and gave him a note from the general that was in charge of Fort Edward saying, "Do it yourself, do it on your own," something along those lines. So, as I was told, the commanding officer of Fort William Henry, he, they let him surrender honorably, so they let them leave. But they left behind sick and wounded. Now, sadly, these sick and wounded weren't able to travel. And as I learned, the Indians didn't take too kindly to anybody. These Indians came from, Lake Superior as far as, and they rather be able to conquer. So what they did is that they massacred a couple hundred of those sick and wounded, and for 5 days, the rest of the sick and wounded that were able to survive came into Fort Edward with stories. And that's quite gruesome. And he said the turning point for the French and Indian War started here with the fall of it, and not too far down is where Saratoga was lost to the British. So a lot of history has happened within 2-3 wars in this general vicinity for the New York region of this area. We got Saratoga here, Fort William Henry here at the French and Indian War, and then we had Revolutionary War soldiers win at Fort Ticonderoga. And a little bit further down that fort, from Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, is where I'm going to be. That's right, I'm going to be down at Plattsburgh, the biggest War of 1812 invasion from the British. It wasn't New Orleans, it wasn't Baltimore. The largest invasion happened north of here at Plattsburgh, from September 6th to September 11th, 1814.